My grandfather's cabin, his flesh and blood legacy, exploded into flames as I stood paralyzed, watching 50 years of family memories turn to ash. Behind me, Diane Blackwell's shadow stretched across the lawn, her silhouette dark against the inferno. "Such a terrible accident," she whispered with venomous satisfaction, adjusting her pastel cardigan. "Perhaps now you'll finally sell me the land and disappear." Her eyes reflected the dancing flames, but mine reflected something far more dangerous: revenge. What this power-drunk HOA tyrant didn't realize was that she had just ignited a war she was destined to lose. To anyone who's ever dealt with HOA nightmares, drop a comment below. You're about to witness one of the most satisfying takedowns you've ever seen. Spring had just begun to soften the air around Pinehurst Lake when I pulled up to the small wooden cabin that now belonged to me. Grandpa Harold had passed away 3 months earlier, and I'd finally gotten enough time off work to come see the place he left me in his will. The cabin had been our special place throughout my childhood, where he taught me to fish, where we played chess on rainy afternoons, where he shared his wisdom about patience and perseverance. "Remember, Ethan," he'd say in that gravelly voice of his, "patience defeats power every time." I never fully understood what he meant until much later. The cabin looked exactly as I remembered: weathered cedar siding, blue-painted shutters, the wide porch where Grandpa's old rocking chair still waited. Inside, everything was neat but dated. Knotty pine walls, worn plaid furniture, fishing gear meticulously organized in the corner. I ran my hand over the dining table where we'd eaten countless meals together, feeling a lump form in my throat. This place was more than property; it was the physical embodiment of my connection to him. I spent the rest of that day cleaning, airing out rooms, and remembering. It wasn't until evening that I noticed an envelope slipped under the door, official-looking, with Pinehurst Estates Homeowners Association printed across the top. "Welcome to the community," it read. "Please schedule an appointment with the HOA office to review regulations applicable to your property." It was signed by an administrative secretary, no name provided. I frowned, reading it twice. Homeowners Association? Grandpa had never mentioned being part of an HOA. The cabin had always seemed so isolated and independent, tucked away at the far end of the lake. I set the letter aside, planning to deal with it the next day. That night, I slept in Grandpa's old room. The familiar smell of cedar and pine brought back a lifetime of memories. Morning brought a knock at the door, a friendly-faced man in his mid-40s with work-worn hands and an open smile. "Thought I'd come introduce myself," he said. "James Cooper. I live in the blue house about a quarter-mile down the shore." Noticed someone was finally back at Harold's place. James helped me fix a leaky pipe under the sink, telling me he'd been friends with my grandfather for years. When I mentioned the HOA letter, his expression changed. "Ah, so they've already contacted you," he said, his voice dropping slightly. "Watch yourself with that bunch. Especially Diane Blackwell, the president. She runs the HOA like a personal kingdom." Before he left, James glanced around the property with concern. "You planning on staying long, fixing the place up?" When I nodded, he seemed troubled but didn't elaborate. Later that afternoon, I found a violation notice taped to my door, no signature, just an official HOA stamp. The list contained 8 items ranging from non-compliant exterior paint color to unauthorized window style and excessive natural vegetation. Each violation included a reference to some HOA code I'd never seen. As I was reading it, I spotted a middle-aged woman in tailored slacks and a cream-colored cardigan standing across the lake, watching my cabin through binoculars. When she saw me notice her, she quickly turned and walked away. Something about her calculated movement sent a chill through me. I drove into town the next day to find the HOA office, a small, overly air-conditioned space in a strip mall. The woman at the desk introduced herself as Pamela Foster, the HOA secretary. She seemed nervous, her eyes darting to the closed office door behind her several times as we spoke. "You've been scheduled to meet with Mrs. Blackwell next week," she said, sliding a thick binder of regulations across the desk. In the meantime, you should address these initial violations." Her voice dropped to a near whisper as she added, "It would be advisable to comply quickly." Before I could ask more questions, she was already helping another resident, effectively dismissing me. On my way back to the cabin, I stopped at James' house. Over beers on his dock, he filled me in on Diane Blackwell's reputation. "She's forced at least 5 families to sell in the last 3 years, he explained. "She uses the HOA rules like weapons, suddenly creates new regulations that target specific properties, then hammers people with fines until they can't take it anymore." James took a long swig of his beer. "Your grandfather was one of the few who stood his ground. Don't know how he managed it, but she never could get her hands on his property." As the sun set over the lake, I found a crumpled piece of paper near my trash cans, a building permit application for the Blackwell Recreation and Spa Center, with a plot map showing its location exactly where my cabin stood. So, that was it. This wasn't about violations at all. Someone wanted my land and was trying to drive me away. I spent the next few days addressing the violations on the list, repainting trim, clearing excessive vegetation, which was actually just native wildflowers, and fixing the supposedly non-compliant mailbox. James helped when he could, and I could feel us forming a friendship similar to what he'd had with my grandfather. The work was frustrating, but straightforward. What bothered me more was the constant feeling of being watched. Several times, I caught glimpses of people taking photos of the property or writing notes while standing at the edge of my land. Every morning brought a new set of challenges. On Wednesday, I awoke to find bright orange stickers on my windows, marking them as non-conforming architectural elements. Thursday delivered a certified letter specifying the exact shade of blue permitted for shutters, a color almost indistinguishable from what I'd already painted them, requiring yet another trip to the hardware store and hours of needless work. By Friday, I discovered someone had entered my property while I was in town and measured my deck, leaving behind a notice claiming it extended exactly 3.5 inches beyond permissible boundaries. The harassment was methodical, relentless, and clearly designed to break my spirit through 1,000 tiny cuts. "This is textbook HOA psychological warfare," James explained as he helped me adjust the deck. "I've seen Diane do this before. She starts with legitimate violations, then moves to increasingly absurd demands until people crack under the pressure." The following Tuesday, I finally met Diane Blackwell face-to-face in her private HOA office. She was precisely as I'd imagined from our brief, distant encounter, immaculately dressed in expensive but conservative clothes, hair perfectly styled, wearing a smile that never reached her cold blue eyes. "Mr. Morgan," she said, gesturing to a chair across from her massive desk. "How lovely to finally meet you. I was so sorry to hear about Harold's passing. He was quite a character in our community." The way she hesitated made it clear what she really thought of my grandfather. Diane spent the first 10 minutes explaining the prestigious nature of Pinehurst Estates and the high standards residents were expected to maintain. Then she got to the point. "I'll be frank with you, Mr. Morgan," she said, folding her manicured hands on the desk. "That cabin is charming in a rustic way, but it simply doesn't meet the aesthetic requirements of our community. We'd like to make you an offer." She slid a document across the desk, a purchase agreement with a figure about 40% below market value. "This would save you the trouble of all those expensive repairs and updates," she added with a thin smile. When I politely but firmly declined, explaining the sentimental value of the property, her expression hardened for just a moment before she regained her composed facade. "I understand completely," she said in a tone that made it clear she didn't. "But you should know that our aesthetic community guidelines were recently updated." She handed me another document. New guidelines required all structures to meet updated standards, including Clause 7b, which stated all buildings must have been constructed after the year 2000. The next 2 weeks became a nightmare of escalation. Despite completing all the original violations, I received a new list of 15 more infractions based on these new guidelines. Out of frustration, I attended the monthly HOA meeting, hoping to understand the rules better and perhaps find allies among other residents. The meeting was held in a small community center by the lake, and I was surprised to see about 30 people in attendance. Diane ran the meeting with parliamentary precision, allowing limited discussion on each agenda item. When my property came up, she projected photos of my cabin on a screen, calling it an outdated relic that needed to be modernized to meet community standards. The slideshow continued with close-up photos of my property taken from angles specifically chosen to make it look dilapidated. Some images had clearly been digitally darkened or shot during poor weather to enhance the negative impression. I recognized this as deliberate manipulation. My cabin was well-maintained despite its age. What shocked me most was realizing someone had been on my property taking photographs through my windows, showing the interior. This wasn't just harassment, it was invasion of privacy. Several residents shifted uncomfortably at these images, sensing the line being crossed, but no one spoke up. I felt my face burning with both embarrassment and anger as Diane narrated each photo with comments about substandard living conditions and community eyes, occasionally glancing at me with barely concealed satisfaction. I stood up and politely pointed out that my cabin had existed long before the HOA was even formed. Several residents nodded in agreement, but Diane quickly cut off discussion. "The board has already voted on these new guidelines," she said, gesturing to William Bennett and 2 other board members who sat stone-faced beside her. "They are now in effect for all properties." As the meeting ended, I noticed how other residents seemed afraid to make eye contact with me. All except for an older woman named Dorothy Miller, who whispered, "She does this to everyone she wants to push out," before hurrying away. The next day, I called my college friend, Olivia Rodriguez, now a real estate attorney in the city. Over lunch at a cafe far from Pinehurst, she reviewed the HOA documents. "There's something called grandfathered properties that might help you," she explained. Properties that existed before the HOA was formed can sometimes be exempt from certain new regulations. Olivia promised to look deeper into it, but warned me that HOAs held considerable power, especially when run by someone determined to use it. As we were leaving, I felt a wave of helplessness wash over me. "Is it even worth fighting?" I asked her. Maybe I should just sell and be done with it. The cabin meant everything to me, but the constant battle was already wearing me down. Olivia squeezed my arm. "That's exactly what she wants you to feel. Ethan, don't give her the satisfaction." Back at the cabin, I found a $5,000 fine notice taped to my door for multiple continuing violations. And a large sign had been planted in my front yard reading HOA violation notice. The sight of it made my stomach twist with anger and embarrassment. As I was removing it, Pamela Foster pulled up in her car, looking around nervously to make sure no one saw her. "Meet me at Lakeside Coffee tomorrow at 10 o'clock, she whispered, pressing a manila envelope into my hands. "I can't do anything more." Before I could respond, she was already driving away. Inside the envelope were old HOA documents, including the original founding charter from 25 years ago. What was so important about these that Pamela would risk her job to show me? And why was she so afraid of Diane? The old HOA documents Pamela gave me turned out to be gold. Working with Olivia, we discovered that the founding charter indeed had a grandfather clause exempting pre-existing structures from certain aesthetic requirements. My cabin, built in the 1960s, clearly qualified. "This could be your legal defense against the new guidelines," Olivia said over the phone. "But Diane won't give up easily. She'll find other ways to pressure you." She wasn't wrong. The next morning, I installed security cameras around the cabin after noticing footprints in the soft earth near my windows. Something about the situation made me increasingly uneasy. This felt like more than just HOA bullying. I strategically placed 4 weatherproof cameras covering all approaches to the cabin, disguising them within birdhouses and landscape lighting to avoid detection. James helped me set up a motion-activated recording system that would alert my phone if anything unusual happened. "I hate that it's come to this," he said as we tested the equipment, but Harold always said the Blackwells couldn't be trusted. He installed a similar system years ago. This revelation surprised me. My easygoing grandfather had felt threatened enough to take security precautions. It confirmed my growing suspicion that the hostility I faced was part of a much longer conflict. That night, scrolling through old emails from Grandpa, I found cryptic references to keeping an eye on the property boundaries and documenting everything. He'd been preparing me for this battle without explicitly warning me. With the cameras in place, I decided to file a report with the local police about the suspicious activity. The officer at the station introduced me to Lieutenant Nathan Harris, a clean-cut man with a perpetually worried expression. He took my statement, but seemed distinctly uncomfortable when I mentioned Diane Blackwell. HOA disputes are generally civil matters, not criminal, he explained, avoiding eye contact. But we can drive by occasionally to keep an eye out. As he was walking me out, I noticed a framed photo on the wall of the police station softball team. In the back row stood a younger Lieutenant Harris, with his arm around a man who looked remarkably like Diane. When I asked about it, Harris stiffened. "That's my cousin by marriage," he said curtly. "Former husband of Diane Blackwell." Suddenly, his reluctance made sense. He was caught between professional duty and family connections. The situation escalated dramatically the next morning when I stepped into the shower and found myself standing under a stream of ice-cold water that quickly reduced to a trickle, then nothing at all. Dripping and shivering, I called the water company only to be informed that service had been temporarily suspended due to potential environmental violations at the request of the Pinehurst Estates HOA. The representative couldn't provide details, but suggested I contact my HOA for more information. When I tried calling the HOA office, Pamela claimed Diane was unavailable and William Bennett refused to discuss the matter. Furious and still without water, I returned to the cabin to find a hazardous materials notice taped to my door, warning neighbors about potential contamination from my property. This was no longer just harassment. It was deliberate public humiliation designed to turn the community against me. I watched an elderly couple walking their dog cross to the other side of the road to avoid passing directly in front of my property, giving it a wide berth as if toxic waste might leap out and attack them. The isolation tactic was working. I was being transformed from a new neighbor into a community threat. I began to understand why previous residents had eventually surrendered to Diane's pressure. Fighting back meant not just battling her, but potentially becoming a pariah in your own neighborhood. That afternoon, I met with several neighbors trying to build allies. Most were sympathetic but terrified of crossing Diane. "She'll come after our properties next," one woman whispered. Another man showed me thousands in HOA fines he'd accumulated over violations that appeared after he voted against Diane at a meeting. Only Dorothy Miller was brave enough to speak openly. "Diane's been talking about some secret water project," she confided as we sat on her porch. "Something about controlling water rights for the entire lake area. Your property sits on a key location." Dorothy had initially supported Diane, but was growing suspicious of her methods. As she spoke, I noticed small acts of vandalism beginning to appear around my property: a flattened tire on my car, garbage dumped on the lawn, scratches on my front door that looked deliberate. That night, I hit my lowest point. Sitting in the dark cabin with no water, surrounded by growing hostility, I called Olivia in tears. "I can't do this anymore," I admitted. "Maybe I should just take her lowball offer and leave." The constant pressure was breaking me down exactly as Diane had planned. Olivia listened patiently before responding. "Remember why you're fighting, Ethan. This isn't just about property. It's about your grandfather's legacy and standing up to a bully." Her words steadied me, and we agreed to file a formal complaint based on the grandfather clause. The next day, while searching through old papers for documentation to support our case, I made an unexpected discovery: a faded photograph of Grandpa Harold arguing with an older man who looked strikingly like Diane. On the back, my grandfather had written, "Argument with Judge Blackwell about water rights. 1985. So, this conflict predated even the HOA. It went back to Diane's father. I was beginning to understand that this was about much more than aesthetic violations. That same evening, William Bennett showed up at my door unannounced. His friendly demeanor couldn't hide the underlying threat in his words. "Diane asked me to see if you've reconsidered her offer," he said. "Things could get uncomfortable if this drags on." Just as he was leaving, he added with false casualness, "You know, strange accidents happen around the lake sometimes. Electrical problems, fires. It would be a shame if anything happened to this old place." That night, my security system alerted me to movement outside. On the camera feed, I saw a shadowy figure moving around the perimeter of my cabin. Heart pounding, I called the police and waited, watching the figure disappear into the darkness before they arrived. Lieutenant Harris took the report but seemed skeptical. "Could have been an animal," he suggested, though we both knew better. As he was leaving, I confronted him about his connection to Diane. His professional facade cracked slightly. "Look, I'm in a difficult position here," he admitted, "but that doesn't mean I won't do my job." I couldn't tell if it was a reassurance or a warning. I woke to the acrid smell of smoke and the sound of crackling wood. For a moment, disoriented from sleep, I thought Grandpa was making a fire in the old stone fireplace. Then reality crashed in. Thick smoke was billowing under my bedroom door, and the crackling was the sound of my home being devoured by flames. I rolled off the bed onto the floor where the air was marginally clearer and crawled toward the door. The handle was hot against my palm, but not searing. The fire hadn't reached this part of the cabin yet. I pulled my shirt over my mouth and nose and made a desperate dash through the smoke-filled main room toward the front door. The heat was intense, pressing against my skin like a physical force, while dark smoke reduced visibility to almost nothing. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to escape, to save myself. Yet somewhere in the chaos of my mind, I remembered my grandfather's gentle voice. "The things that matter most aren't things at all. They're the memories we carry." The photograph of Grandpa and me on his 70th birthday, the last one before he passed, sat on the mantel in its hand-carved frame. Without thinking, I turned back, lungs burning as I fumbled through the thickening smoke. My outstretched fingers found the familiar wooden edge of the frame, just as an ominous crack sounded above me. I looked up to see a section of the ceiling glowing orange, ready to collapse. My fingers closed around the frame just as the blazing timber crashed down behind me, missing me by inches. The heat was unbearable now, the roar of the fire drowning out everything except the pounding of my heart. With one final surge of energy, I stumbled out the front door and collapsed onto the dew-wet grass, gasping for clean air as I watched my grandfather's legacy transform into a tower of flame against the night sky. In the chaos that followed, time seemed to blur. Neighbors appeared in robes and pajamas. Someone called 911, and soon the quiet was shattered by sirens and shouted commands as firefighters battled the blaze. But it was too late. By dawn, the cabin was nothing but a smoldering skeleton of blackened beams and ash. I sat wrapped in a blanket someone had provided, clutching the slightly singed photograph to my chest, feeling hollow with shock and grief. Through the haze, I became aware of Diane Blackwell standing at the edge of the property, speaking with a tall, nervous-looking young man I would later learn was her nephew, Tyler. Even in the chaos, she was perfectly put together, in pressed slacks and a camel-colored coat. When she saw me looking, she nudged Tyler and they both walked over. "What a terrible tragedy," Diane said, her voice dripping with manufactured sympathy. "These old buildings with their outdated wiring, I've always said they were fire hazards." She placed a manicured hand briefly on my shoulder. "When you're ready to discuss selling the property, my offer still stands. It would help you move past this unfortunate incident." The barely concealed satisfaction in her eyes made my blood boil, even through my exhaustion and despair. As she turned away, she murmured just loud enough for only me to hear. "So sorry about your cabin. Perhaps now you should sell the land and leave." That was the moment I knew with absolute certainty. Diane Blackwell had orchestrated this. As the first rays of sunlight illuminated the devastation, I felt a hollowness unlike anything I'd experienced before. This wasn't just about losing a building. It was about losing the last physical connection to my grandfather, the place where so many of my childhood memories lived. The cabin had been more than wood and stone. It was the embodiment of my relationship with Grandpa Harold, a sanctuary of wisdom and warmth. Now it was gone, reduced to char and ash, and with it, a piece of myself seemed to have burned away as well. I sat motionless for hours, staring at the ruins, barely registering the firefighters packing up their equipment or the neighbors offering condolences. In those dark moments, I understood what true despair felt like, a bottomless void where hope couldn't find purchase. The firefighters worked methodically, dousing hot spots and securing the scene. The chief, a weathered man in his 50s, approached me with a clipboard. "Preliminary assessment suggests an electrical origin," he explained. His tone was professional but kind. "These older structures can have wiring issues." I started to protest, to explain about the updated electrical system, but the words died in my throat. What was the point? Without evidence, it would be my word against Diane's. And I was quickly learning how the power dynamics in Pinehurst worked. Instead, I nodded numbly and signed the forms he presented, my signature a shaky approximation of itself. The preliminary fire investigation reported undetermined cause, possible electrical malfunction, despite my protests that the wiring had been completely updated just 5 years earlier. Lieutenant Harris took my statement, but seemed uncomfortable when I suggested arson, especially when I mentioned seeing Diane and her nephew watching the fire with what appeared to be satisfaction. "That's a serious accusation without evidence, Mr. Morgan," he warned. I could see the conflict in his eyes, duty versus family loyalty. But without proof, there was nothing he could do. The next day, as I sifted through the ash-covered remains of what had been my kitchen, I found my grandfather's cast-iron skillet, blackened but intact. I ran my fingers over the smooth surface, remembering countless pancake breakfasts and fireside dinners. For some reason, this simple object, surviving when so much had been destroyed, broke through the numbness I'd been feeling. I sank to my knees in the soot and wept openly, clutching the skillet to my chest like it was the most precious treasure on earth. James found me like that, gently placing a hand on my shoulder. And in that moment, something inside me shifted.